fantasy football starts of the week for week 5, starting off with Brock Purdy, who currently ranks second in passing yards in the NFL, and he faces the Cardinals, who allow the fourth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Najee Harris rushed for 70 yards and caught 5 passes in week 3. Then he finished with 54 receiving yards in week 4. He faces the Cowboys, who allow the third most fantasy points per game to running backs and the sixth most rushing yards this season. Last week, DeAndre Swift finished with 93 yards and a rushing touchdown. He also caught 7 passes for 72 yards. He faces the Carolina Panthers, who allow the second most fantasy points per game to running backs and the fourth most rushing yards. Denver's defense allowed them to establish the run last week with Javonte Williams. He rushed 16 times for 77 yards. I think it's going to be a similar game script against the Raiders, who allow the eighth most fantasy points per game to running backs. Terry McLaurin the last 2 weeks has scored 20 and 18.2 fantasy points. He scored a touchdown in each of those games, had 100 receiving yards in week 3, earned 10 targets in week 4. He faces the Browns, who allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. T. Higgins has been targeted 16 times across the last 2 weeks. He's coming off of a 60-yard game, and he now faces the Ravens, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 4th most passing yards this season. Jerry Jeudy has been outperforming Amari Cooper for fantasy football and faces the Commanders, who allow the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then following a great week, Tucker Kraft faces the Rams, who allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to tight ends.